Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. With that, it's 2:04. Let's start. Um, okay, and I would like to start today's session with a simple quote. And the quote is, if you're always trying to be normal, you'll never know how amazing you can be. And that's a quote that's by Maya Angelou. And that's why we're here today, to redefine what's normal so that each of us can thrive. And so in the midst of the civil rights movement that's going on, a really important time, we have to think to ourselves, how do we think about working together? And so thank you again for everyone who's continuing to show up. This is our first webinar, so it's great to see this much traction. And not only is it a big crowd, but it's also a very engaged crowd. Just prior to this webinar, we've gotten over 60 questions that have been submitted prior to the event. And so definitely a lot of thoughts about what's going on right now, how people are thinking about diversity in this modern workplace. And if you have any more questions, feel free to submit them in the chat at any point. And so if you look below, there's a chat where you can chat to everybody. And we have members of our team who are going to be gathering each one of the questions that are being submitted live, as well as categorizing them into different themes. So feel free to submit them at any point, and we'll do our best to address them as we see those themes popping up. And just a bit about me, I started Sukhi, which is a social venture based out of Washington, D.C., as a way to build a bridge between mental wellness and cultural sensitivity. And at Sukhi, we provide corporate mindfulness as well as culturally appropriate mental wellness solutions. And so prior to starting this venture, I was a consultant at McKinsey, and I also worked in international development for the UN as well as USAID, where I was a gender specialist. I have a background in psychology and in mindfulness as well. But this is not about me. The real stars of this afternoon's show are here today, our panelists. And to our panelists, just feel free to wave when I mention your name. We have 3 different esteemed panelists from varying backgrounds, each one of them with their own perspectives. So let's start with Monica Oldham. She is the head of the World Bank Group's Office of Diversity and Inclusion. She works closely with the HR department to ensure all the business agendas are in line with that of their team, while providing leadership, guidance, and support to drive impact. Next, we have David Bell, who's been part of the technical recruiting team and the manager for community engagement at Airbnb, a place that really does define what home can be in the modern age. David has been part of several tech companies, and he's supported diverse hiring initiatives, radically transforming the way several large companies attract, hire, as well as retain top talent. And finally, we have Danielle Kayal, our third panelist, who's been working in talent development and HR management for over 15 years. She's certified in the HBDI assessment, which helps individuals and teams apply diversity and inclusion principles from a cognitive lens. Currently, she is an HR consultant to small and medium-sized companies on a range of initiatives that support business development. So we have an awesome panel here. So thank you to our panelists so much for joining. In our first question, I'll direct this to Monica. And the first one is really about defining the space that we're working in right now in terms of what D&I is. And so the first question is, what is the difference between diversity and inclusion, and why is it D&I versus I and D?
Thanks, Rahul. You hear a lot of the little phrases: diversity is the mix, inclusion is getting the mix right. Diversity is being asked to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. That's Renee Myers. But I like the one about the mix and getting the mix right, because diversity is all of our differences and similarities. It's all of the things that make us individuals, it makes me, me. But inclusion is leveraging it, because inclusion has to be active. So how do I leverage your differences, your similarities? How do I leverage you working with me to achieve a common goal? So it is not just inclusion for the sake of inclusion. That's what diversity is. It's how do we bring all of this together to work towards something that we all believe in? And in terms of why, at least within the World Bank Group, we do diversity and inclusion rather than inclusion and diversity, is by our nature, the World Bank Group is diverse. We have people from 189 countries. But just because we all come together doesn't mean that we work well together. That's why the inclusion piece is absolutely necessary. Because without the inclusion, the diversity, it just doesn't work. Everybody is just going to be very, very siloed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that, Monica. Yeah, for the other panelists, how do you feel about D&I versus IND, and if there needs to be a focus on one of those?
I guess from my perspective, oftentimes when D&I is brought up and when these issues are brought up within companies, the focus shifts to recruiting and shifts to hiring and shifts to diversifying pipelines, diversifying our hiring initiatives to get more people into the funnel and more people into the company. But if the company is not an inclusive environment already, you're not creating a safe space for those employees to enter into. So it really does have to be approached at both sides. You can't have something that's simply focused on diversity or simply focused on inclusion. These things have to work in partnership to create an environment that is safe and can facilitate people's bring their best selves to work each and every day. You have to tackle both at the same time concurrently.
And I would just add that I think the notion of equity has also emerged as a real key category of D&I, that people talk about it as DEI. And I think equity is a really important concept to understand, because even though you are practicing inclusive principles, you still need to think about are those inclusive principles accessible for certain individuals. And if they're not accessible at the same rate, or at the same thing, then you have something wrong in your inclusion strategy. So I do kind of like the addition of equity in the recent years, but definitely believe that you kind of need to start with that diversity mixture before and then kind of work on inclusion as, more of an active process.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And I know a lot of people on this panel are very big fans of metrics, whether it's in international development or in tech. Everything these days seems to be data driven. And so in terms of thinking about D&I or DEI, what are the gold standard metrics that we should be thinking about right now? And why don't we start this one with David?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to have a foundation of data and a foundation of analysis to understand where the holes are in your bucket and if the bucket is really leaky and how to approach solving those problems. But it becomes tough because you don't want to swim in a pool of analysis and forget that you need to have a bias for action as well. That's something that has been a struggle for us at Airbnb because data integrity has not always been something that's been prioritized over the years. It's something that we're really driving home over the last couple of years, I'd say, and looking at pass-through rates as candidates are going through our pipeline from a hiring perspective, seeing what performances look like, seeing how we're incentivizing our recruiting and sourcing teams to go out into the world and to bring talent into our pipelines. And so we do need metrics to track our performance and to see how we're approaching those things and if we're on the right path. But we often find that in analyzing the data and in trying to figure out, if we're doing things properly, sometimes we end up spending too much time on that and not enough time on, devising solutions to our problems and getting things in place that can, address those problems in a more immediate way, recognizing the need that employees have, again, on that inclusion piece for solutions first and foremost. So again, I'm going to be saying this pretty frequently, but it is a balancing act. Looking at the data, looking at these metrics, trying to figure out what we should be tracking, but then also maintaining that bias for action, making sure that we are still putting things in place and making changes wherever we can to support the employees that are already here. So that's kind of just the foundation that I have for approaching metrics, approaching analysis. But then when you drill down into things, there are so many approaches that you can take when you're looking at the performance of a company. You do want to see the population breakdown and see, where there are more and where there are less, and what and what your company should be representing. Oftentimes we look to map the representation of the population and the companies, or where we are, where we're offering our products or our services. But sometimes you need to go a little bit beyond that. Sometimes you have to be more innovative in your thinking. You have to bend the stick a little bit farther. It's not enough to just map what already exists when what already exists is not doing enough. So we also have to press ourselves a little bit farther, a little bit outside our comfort zone. If we're seeing that our Black and brown candidates in our interview processes are performing okay relative to overrepresented populations, I feel like that shouldn't be something that should allow us to rest on our laurels. We should be pressing for them to be performing a little bit stronger or doing a little bit better, in order to, again, bend the stick in the right way and get more equity again across.
Sure. And I love how you said kind of paralysis or swimming in that pool of analysis. That's an analysis through paralysis. It's a lovely metaphor. And just to get more specific here, Monica, what are some of the specific metrics that the World Bank is using in terms of when they're measuring diversity and when they're measuring inclusivity? Like, what are the actual variables that they're looking for?
Yeah, I wanted to build on what David was saying, because it's really easy to get data. It's really easy to get analysis, but why? What question are you trying to answer? If you're not sure on what question you're trying to answer, you're just going to be spiraling. And so you have to start with the business. That's why we're here. We're in business. And so if you have a team that is not performing well, why not? And it could be based on inclusion. So we have diversity metrics as well as inclusion metrics. So for inclusion metrics, we actually have an inclusion index, and it's a subset of questions that are on our annual engagement survey. So we look at the questions in terms of how does a unit answer, and then we break it down. How do women answer versus men? How do more junior staff answer versus the more senior staff? How do managers answer versus the rest of staff? How do staff who are based in the field answer compared to staff who are in headquarters? Because that tells us where the issue is. Because if the question is that you feel that managers are held accountable when their actions are contrary to our values of diversity and inclusion, everybody at headquarters says yes, everybody in the field says no, that's where we need to get to. If it is a question about, I feel that, like we always say, that people are valued regardless of their gender identity, all of those. But we have certain pockets of staff who say, no, I don't feel that. That tells us where we need to get to. So for very specific metrics, we have only one that we measure, and that's gender. And that is basically, we have a target of parity at all grades, 50-50. We used to measure percentage of women, but now we say, no, it has to be men and women. Right now, we're looking at it that way because we don't have within our system the ability just yet to tag whether somebody is non-binary. But because our system has to, because we're a bank, we talk to a lot of other systems, and it has to be consistent. So what we send, for instance, to the State Department has to be consistent. But we have a separate set of diversity indicators that staff can voluntarily go in and fill in, and we call it I count, because no matter who you are, we all count. And so staff can self-identify by race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, whether they're working with a disability, nationality at birth, because that's a big thing, and whether they have multiple nationalities, and we build on those all the time. And right now, we are going through a huge push to get more staff to volunteer this data, and then once we get up to a certain percentage, then we'll be able to do analysis to see, okay, are all staff having similar experiences? if we're talking about being successful with a particular project, what are we finding in terms of staff background are more successful? So therefore, who do we need to develop a little bit more? Do we need to bring in staff from other regions? And I liked what David was saying in terms of how a lot of organizations try to mirror the customer base. Well, you also want to bring in innovation. So you want to bring in other ideas that are not necessarily from that location. So it's not just limiting ourselves to that, but how broad, how diverse can we make every single team? And then what do we need to put in place from an inclusion standpoint, as well as development, to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to be successful on that team and that project?
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. And Danielle, because of your consulting background, you've seen a wide variety of different clients and different sets of metrics among different industries. And so from your perspective, what are some of the gold standards, regardless of size of a company or regardless of industry, where you're seeing these gold standard metrics for organizations?
I really think it depends on the industry, to be honest. I don't think there really are gold standards. I think it just depends on to Monica's point, what is exactly the problem and what are they trying to look at? I found that data represents a little bit of it looks like candy. It looks like, okay, let me just, I want some candy. I want to know how much, if it makes us feel good, because we can measure it, we can count, we can be like, okay, we made some progress. But I think it's also kind of a buffer, because for that real behavior change to happen, for the real inclusive behaviors to take hold, it's going to be uncomfortable. And so I think from a surface level, companies wind up staying at let me just count all the different diversity per location, let me check my customer base, let me check my board of directors. And then, then they can take, their hands off the wheel, because the other stuff, you have to internalize it. It's not going to be an overnight thing where, and by next quarter, you're going to see rapid results. For real change, it's really going to take time. It's going to take commitment. And so again, this is kind of like, I love data, and I love having inclusive data about inclusive metrics are really, really important over the topical data. But I really think it just depends on what is the company trying to do, and what does success look like to them? Because that's really the ultimate data point, at least to start the conversation, and then you kind of drill down to figure out, like, okay, well, you do have to, there are some times where you're going to collect the preliminary data, like whether it's attitudinal or whether it's demographic data, but it's really about kind of drilling down and figuring out what they're looking to do.
Got it. Yeah. And
the question I had was, in terms of broadening it out to, are there any examples of people or organizations that you're seeing that are doing a particular good job, whether it's in development or whether it's in certain industries, that you're saying, okay, these people or these organizations are setting a good job on what it means to have a solid D&I foundation in place?
Yeah, I think I will echo what Danielle was mentioning, in that I don't think that there's one company that has figured it out or found a one-size-fits-all solution to diversity and inclusion. That solution doesn't exist. As we've all mentioned, we do have to cater these solutions to the needs that each company may have. At Airbnb, we definitely have peer companies that we, aspire to emulate, or, try to share some best practices around. In my career in the past, I've been inspired by some of the work that Slack has done previously. I've taken some inspiration from my time at Google as well. But I also recognize some of the shortcomings there too, and some things that I might want to try to implement differently. For example, I know that Slack in the past took on blind assessments as part of their interview process to varying degrees of success. And I know the origin story of blind assessments in the orchestra space. But when looking to implement something like that at Airbnb, I also saw some of the shortcomings that we had there. We were trying to implement blind assessments, especially at the application review stage. But what does it mean from a candidate's perspective to be blind when on paper and when being reviewed on a resume, but then maybe when you come in for an on-site, you're not blind there. People can see you and they're interacting with you. And then when you're actually on the job, if we think about the inclusion piece as well, when you're having performance reviews, when you're building a relationship with your manager, what does that mean? What is your experience like? If we, try to obscure that piece of who you are at a certain part of our hiring process. So for the time being, we decided that blind assessments isn't really something that would work for us, or at least something that we would need to dig a lot deeper into and to study and to see the potential ramifications there. So that's just one experience that we had in, trying to take bits and pieces of what we're seeing from our peers, the success that we've seen and some of the challenges that we've seen as well, and try to work that into our ecosystem in a way that makes sense for us. Again, I don't think there's one size fits all solutions. I am constantly looking out for innovators in this space, for people, for companies, for businesses. But I think, you can find it in so many different places. I find a lot of inspirations even in my Twitter feed with the people that I'm following. So I think you can find inspiration, you can find ideas in a lot of different places. We don't necessarily have to rely on other companies to provide us with those solutions. I think we really need to just foster innovative and creative thinking in every aspect of what we're doing.
I agree, because I think it's also, I remember, when I was working at a large company, I would look at other large companies and look at what their policy was, how many ERGs they had, and how robust they were. And I feel like the bigger the company, the longer they've had practices in place, and the savvy of kind of their PR and marketing can make them really appear that they are the best company to work for. They've got it all figured out. But I think it's something it's an ongoing process. It's and it almost has to be. And looking for other companies as role models is a good idea, as long as you kind of don't emulate them, and especially when the context of your organization is different.
And I would add that we don't use the term best practice, because the best practice is only best for them. Unless your context is exactly the same, it's not going to work. And so we do a lot of benchmarking. So we benchmark against the other international development organizations, the other like the American the Asian Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. So our counterparts within the multilateral development banks. But we also benchmark based on a particular topic. So for instance, for gender, we got certification through EDGE, which is economic dividends through gender equality. And they have a huge database of several different types of companies, but it's all around gender equality. And again, it's for doing that business. So working through EDGE, anything that we want to talk about for gender, we work with them. If it's for disabilities, then there are other organizations that we will work with who have been doing a lot of really, really good work. So for overall, it is our counterparts, but then doing the benchmarking on a very specific basis, so we could see what can we learn from you, what can we learn from you.
Mm-hmm. And I want to go back to a point that David brought up about blind recruiting. And David, do you mind real quick just defining it for people on the call who might not know what it means? And I'd love to hear your thoughts as a group on whether or not this is something that should be employed, or whether or not it's something that you've seen work and things like that.
Yeah. So blind assessment, it can take many different forms. You can have single blind, you can have double blind, where both the interviewer and the interviewee are blind to the process. And what I mean by blind is that we would be obscuring some personal identifiable information, especially demographic information. So things related to, maybe your name, if that's a signifier in some way, your race, your gender, your ethnicity. A lot of those things can be obscured from the interview process to have a more objective approach going into the interviews. Obviously, that's something that's important and something that you want to uphold when you enter into any interview process. You want to be as objective as possible. But, there are issues with blindness in many senses. If you think about color blindness in the world, and I mean that from a racial perspective of saying things like, I don't see color, and how that can be kind of erasing to people's lived experiences. I think that's also something that we have to recognize when we are, evaluating and assessing candidates or prospective candidates or people that you're looking to bring into your organization. How important is it to maintain objectivity, but how important also is it to recognize the complexity of the people that you're engaging with, and to see that, there are things that I maybe can't hide within myself, or that I don't want to hide within myself. So often people talk about bringing their full self to work. And that's really important to be able to allow people to do that. But then also we have to think about, the ramifications of what that means. If you are, facilitating an environment where someone is bringing their full self, you have to make sure that there aren't negative ramifications to that or unfair ramifications to that. So that's pretty much what I mean when I talk about blind assessments, but definitely want to hear from other panelists about their thoughts.
Yeah, we've done some within the World Bank group, and like you said, with varying results. So, for instance, one of our indicators, as I mentioned, is for gender, and it used to be that we measured specifically that had a target of at least 50% women, and at least 50% of women at whether it was managers or in the senior technical grades. And the downside is that for some units, they said, oh, if 50% is good, then 65% is better. And we changed it. We said, no, parity. But before that, we had a lot of units who would really, really try to hire more women. And so we worked with an organization. We had our own internal team that does, we call them, it's the Mind, Behavior, and Development, or MBED team. And so they worked with us, and we had a small test where we did blind review of CVs, taking out any reference to gender. And what we found was that the women actually did worse, because there was already an unconscious bias to give the women more credit, because we knew that we were underrepresented in certain units. And so the women wound up coming out equal, but therefore they actually did worse. And so we said, okay, that wasn't quite what we thought we were going to do. But on the other hand, we recently had to winnow 411 applicants for a task force down to about 50. And they were all internal applicants. So what we did is we removed everything except for their statement of interest and their responses to questions about what can we do about this particular topic, what are the top 3 things that the task force should do, and what are the top 3 things that should happen in the field. That was it. And then once we got down to about 80, then we started looking at the demographics so that we could make sure that we had balance between men and women, people in the field versus headquarters. But the initial review was blind except for what mattered, which is what David was saying. Okay, what is it that you're looking at? We want to see, what are your thoughts? What are you saying we should do? That's all that we looked at to get down to that short list. And then the demographics did count. So sometimes diversity is a distinguishing factor. And so when diversity became a distinguishing factor, that's when we brought it in.
Got it. Cool. And yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about recruitment for a second, because blindness is certainly part of that recruitment process. But we've heard from a lot of people in HR and recruitment that we want to hire diverse candidates. It's just that we don't know where to find them, or they don't exist at the caliber, at the level that we want it. And that obviously is likely not the case, but in terms of thinking about, all right, where do I find diverse applicants for the jobs I'm doing? What are some suggestions or thoughts that you have on this process? And why don't we start with you, Danielle? But I'm sure everyone on this panel has a lot of thoughts about this.
Yeah, I definitely think it involves being, trying to think outside the box and be a little bit creative. Sometimes, talking to employees within the company, learning about them, learning about, okay, what are the things you do after work? Where are the places you go, or what sort of professional organizations do you belong to? That can be definitely a starting point. And, just continuing to network and be curious and get out of your own 5 mile radius. Sometimes it takes kind of going to, even though maybe now is not the time to do the 1 hour drive to the next city, but sometimes it takes, really getting out of your own neighborhood, and even getting out of your own neighborhood is going to spur up all these different thoughts about, where else could you find talent? But I think it's a lot of it's about knowing what you're looking for. And then, in my experience, we were recruiting engineers. And so looking at like the colleges that had, the best engineering programs, and using, there's an organization called Handshake, which helps facilitate the process of meeting new employers from recent college grads. So we were partnering with Handshake and trying to at least, establish ourselves as a name there. But I think the key is to experiment, to continue to kind of network, gather ideas, and don't just think it's all about Indeed, it's all about Glassdoor or LinkedIn. You have to really take the time to think about it, and think about, exactly who you're trying to find. Mm-hmm. And some of it could be where, it could be even, we're having a discussion. It could be, oh, wait, I know somebody who has a great background, and let me introduce you. So it can happen anywhere, but it's being open-minded for the leads to come up.
And I would say to figure out what it is you're trying to hire. What is it that you want the person to do? And then, are you writing the job description like your own CV? You want someone just like you? Or are you writing the job description for the job? Because too often we say, well, so-and-so is not a good fit. Fit means just like me. And so we have a tendency to keep looking, well, where would I apply for this job? We're not trying to hire you. You're already here. So if we keep fishing in the same pond, we're going to keep getting the same fish. So we need to think, what about this job is different? What about this candidate is different from somebody who we already have, somebody who's going to bring something new to the team? And where do we go for them? Because it may be someplace you've never gone before, but if you keep thinking, oh, where would I apply? At the bank, we have what we call post and pray. You post it online and you pray you get the diversity you want. It doesn't work. And so we've had to go much broader, even changing how we write the job description, because we were finding that we were getting a certain type of candidate when we wrote it a certain way. So once we started changing how we wrote it, we started getting in some of the diversity we were looking for.
I'm glad you mentioned the writing of the job descriptions, because that's another place that we kind of often forget how biased and how dated it can be, even in how we write it.
Yep.
And this is, sorry, keep going, Dan.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking of, like, if somebody has to not only internalize, yes, I have most of these responsibilities, but also I have to think of the company and their impression of the company. And if I'm going to go to a company where everybody's not like me, would I really want to do that anyway? So I think it also kind of looks at job descriptions and looks at the employer brand itself, and what people's perception of that brand is.
Sure.
And just to chime in here, because this is a topic that hits really close to home for me, just coming from the recruiting space and leading a team of sourcers, this is a challenge each and every day to get them to think more innovatively, more creatively about how to build up diverse pipelines. And I really do think it depends on our abilities to redefine what we think of as a good candidate. I really love what Monica was getting at there, where, we don't want to hire more of the same. We really have to think outside the box. And so much of what recruiters and sourcers do in the industry is a lot of pattern matching. I understand why that happens. I get the conditions on why that comes into play, but I do think that we need to think a little bit outside the box there. And what we were doing within my team was trying to find opportunities where we can meet people where they are. And take advantage of the flexibility that we had to go places back when we could do that. I was leading an initiative where we were hosting batch days around the country. So we would go to, cities like Atlanta or DC and have programming for them that would be beneficial for people who are interested in interviewing or not, just ways that we could positively impact the community, but then also have those opportunities to interview as well, in a way that is more accessible and easier for people than, flying out to the Bay Area or flying out to San Francisco to come here and interview with us. So finding opportunities to meet people where they are, thinking innovatively about how to approach the space and not applying pattern matching to every time we try to source. But then also, we can take advantage too of the new environment that we're in right now. I think something that's interesting with 2020 is that in many ways, it's an experiment in remote work, and in finding different alternatives to having, employees at a company and what productivity can look like. And I think with that heightened flexibility, we can, start to move outside of our ponds. For my teams here in San Francisco and the Bay Area, so often it is just a crutch, or just a habit to continually source from companies in San Francisco, companies in Silicon Valley. But now that we've kind of broken down those barriers to entry around, you don't have to come to San Francisco to be a productive contributing member of Airbnb, we have a lot more flexibility to engage with people all across the world and to find, different personality types, different working styles, different ways where we can influence our organization and have better representation inside our walls.
Yeah, no, so many good water analogies coming out of this conversation, whether it's the pond that we're fishing in or the pools that we're swimming in. That was a lot of good stuff there, a lot of great content. Thank you all for your thoughts on that. And I see ourselves slowly inching towards the idea of the times that we're in right now. And so I don't want to, act like what's going on right now in the era of the pandemic and BLM is not part of the workplace, because it certainly is. And so especially right now, companies, I feel, are increasingly relying on the role of the chief diversity officers. And this question actually comes from one of our mentors. His name is Fahad, and he set up a marketplace for marketing people of color, as well as recruiters who are looking for marketing people of color. And he just released an article that had a pretty radical concept where it says, the role of the chief diversity officer is antiquated, because it's counterproductive in building a company culture that integrates diversity into each aspect of its organization. And I've seen analog comparisons for chief sustainability officers in companies, or gender specialists in the development world and nonprofit world. And so my question to this entire panel is, do we need the chief diversity officer? And what, if so, what is that role? What should it be? Let's start with Monica.
That's hard to say, because, whether it's a CBO, or I've seen chief inclusion officer, chief people officer, and chief purpose officer. It's all the same thing. But, regardless, I don't care if you call it Fred, what are they doing? Are they helping the organization to build a more inclusive environment? I'm lucky where I am at the bank group, because we have a dual reporting relationship. I report to the VP of HR and the president's office. And so that dual reporting helps us to get, so we're tied in hand with all of our HR colleagues in the program, so what it really takes, but then also with leadership. So we're able to work through them, and we have a council on diversity and inclusion, which is senior staff all the way to the most junior staff. So working with them and a whole network of people, which I find is much more appealing and much more effective than having somebody with a title that says Chief Diversity Officer if they don't have the power. Too many of my counterparts where it's just them or 1.5 people. But if you don't have the ability to work with people at all layers within the organization everywhere, then it's not going to be really sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. And just to build on that, on top of that, I definitely think that, you know, the title needs to have some level of authority behind it in order to be effective. And I would love to say that I would love it if we lived in a world where, you know, a head of D&I or those types of roles are a little bit more antiquated, because we do take on the mantra of, you know, diversity is everyone's responsibility. Everybody should be collectively working towards this. It should be the foundation of how we operate in a general sense. But I also see some of the shortcomings, you know, within Airbnb, but also in some of our peer companies, where there is a need for executive buy-in. There is a need for support and endorsement and advocates at the very top. I see it through some of the initiatives that I'm a part of right now. We're actually looking to completely revamp our technical interview process, and we've brought together a council of engineers, both engineering leadership, but then also some individual contributors on the engineering side to help out with that effort. But especially for those individual contributors, there's a lot of concern because they're like, I want to dedicate a lot of my time and energy into this work. I would love to have it, you know, comprise a good percentage of the work that I'm expected to produce. But my direct manager, I don't know if they'll support me, you know, dedicating a lot of time and effort and energy to this, especially when there's so many different things going on that do have high priority and importance. Obviously, this is, from my perspective, the most important or one of the most important. So there is a need to get buy-in from the very top to say, no, this is baked into our company-wide priorities. This is something that can be reflected positively, the work that you do here in performance reviews. It won't be a ding or knock against you that you're taking time away from other things to dedicate time for these diversity initiatives. We do need that buy-in from the very top. And so that's where I do see value from people in those roles, head of D&I, you know, chief people officer, these types of things, because they can advocate on behalf of the people who are on the ground doing this work with leadership, get e-staff on board or whoever is in those positions of most power, and make sure that everybody is aligned there. So, you know, and in an ideal world, we wouldn't need this, but I think in the world that we live in right now, we do.
Yeah, I would agree definitely that having a presence, having a true stakeholder and true person at the executive level for diversity and inclusion is as important as having somebody from legal, is as important as having somebody from HR, is as important as having somebody from finance. It's all about what's the business model, like how is the business run, and having the right knowledge and skills at the table is really important when making decisions for the entire company. I also think that you don't necessarily need to have a chief diversity officer to start if you don't have a program in place. I think that, and I even have, experience where it can start organically and it really just depends on the size of the organization, the needs, the scope of the decision. But I don't think companies have to wait a year before they hire the right person to take charge. They can start diversity initiatives now with just, more increased self-awareness and knowledge and education and dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And just to keep on this theme of the times that we're living in, we received a lot of questions about, right now is a tense period of time. Employers seem to really care about a lot of issues that they weren't previously caring about. But how do we make sure that this is not just the flavor of the month, right? How do we make sure that we can actually create sustained diversity efforts? And I had no good answer to that. But in your minds, what are some ways that these efforts that are now being kind of culminating to this point, how do we make sure that they keep on going and that this doesn't fizzle Yeah, whoever wants to start.
Well, I say that. Oh, was that Danielle?
I was starting to talk, but you talk first.
Go
So
ahead.
go for it.
Oh yeah. So I was just gonna say, and now I've lost my train of thought. Danielle, go ahead.
I mean, I view it as, first of all, kind of don't promise what you can't deliver, and kind of own up to that. You know, if I'm going to say I'm going to do something, then I'm going to follow through as somebody of integrity and good business practice to make sure I commit to what I said I was going to do. And I think that kind of falls on whoever's doing that. But that being said, I feel like every person has, at least kind of people I've talked to, has internalized it and have really started to think about what they can do as a person and how they can be accountable. And even having, you know, accountability, you can start at the team level. And, you know, once you kind of bring it up at the team level, and you can talk about, you know, how can we make a difference, or how can we make things better, even at the team level, and hold each other accountable on team level. But you're right. I mean, I think it's easy to kind of jump out of the gate with, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And poof, you know, 6 months later, and you're like, what's been done? So it's kind of really not jumping to make those gaping statements without understanding what you want to do and how and what your plan is to get there. And then being very transparent about that plan all the way through, not just kind of the one and done, here's my corporate, or here's my PR pitch that it's going to be on Twitter and all these things. It's actually saying every month, here's the update on what I said I was going to do. And admitting, hey, we didn't maybe make as much progress as we thought, but we've learned, and here's what we're going to do differently.
Mm-hmm. And I got back on my train of thought now. So
right.
definitely, yeah, it's perfect. So to add on to that, I agree with everything that Danielle mentioned there. And I think it's also important that we create structures to listen. I think listening is hugely important in this moment. Some, you know, difficult situations that I've seen recently are, you know, there's been a lot of energy, there's been a lot of discussion. We are definitely in a moment right now, just lighting that fire again for the civil rights movement that we're in right now. And there have been a lot of people generating ideas, but I've seen things come up where ideas were put forward, trying to solve a problem. Say it's a problem that's affecting the Black community specifically, or it's perceived to affect the Black community specifically, but then Black employees raise their hands and they're like, wait, this actually wasn't something that was super important for us. If people had taken the time to listen to us and our needs, you would realize what is important and what is of value. So we have to be careful not to jump the gun and move directly into trying to change things before listening to those marginalized groups first and foremost. So, you know, being active listeners, creating structures and systems to continually listen on an ongoing basis so that it isn't a flash in the pan moment. Is very important. Something that we did internally here is within the ERGs, we had listening sessions first and foremost to allow for just free thinking and offloading of just emotions, thoughts, feelings. And then after that, we had idea generation sessions where those same groups could get together and brainstorm things that they feel would be most effective. And now we are consolidating those ideas and bubbling them up to e-staff to continue the movement and have more people involved in taking action and moving forward with active steps. So I think it's important to first and foremost listen to these communities, listen to these marginalized groups, and then create structures for continued listening and also for action that involves more people.
And the one thing that I would add is, even before the listen, is learn. Because we've had too many cases where someone will go to a Black or brown colleague, tell me about that slavery history. Okay, I'm a product of the US public education system. I learned the same thing you did. So everything that I learned has been me taking it on. So we have to do our own homework. So learn and then listen. So come to the conversation somewhat informed rather than asking somebody else to do the homework for you. And then to David's point, then leverage. It does no good if you just, you know, learn something and sit around, but you don't do anything with it. So leverage what you've learned, leverage what you've heard so that we can make that lasting change. And we have a very unique opportunity right now, because smart businesses will look at this from a business perspective. Staff are at home. Staff are worried. They are worried that, that they could be losing their jobs if their company is a little bit shaky with what's going on, or if it's a company that is not in danger of going out of business. You still have so many staff who are worried about getting sick. And when you have all of that stress and everything else on top of it, that can affect productivity. So it is in a business owner's best interest to make sure that they put everything in place that they possibly can to take any weight off of the staff member's shoulders so that they can continue to be productive. And so if I'm sitting at home and I'm worried about my brother or my cousin out on the street getting shot, it's hard for me to really focus on something right now. So as a good manager, again, learn what's going on and then listen to me. Know that I'm not just whinging. This is something that is really affecting me. So let's talk about it, and let's talk about how we can make sure that we protect all of our staff, not just our staff of color, because everybody's involved in this. So make sure that we can protect all of our staff so that they can think, okay, yes, this company really does care about me, not just now, but in the future. So yes, I'm going to continue to give everything that I can right now, knowing that what I can give right now is not necessarily going to be as much as I could give before because of all of this added stress, but that the company will still be there for me when I'm back up to 100%, say in 6 months from now.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. We're at the end of the day, companies and organizations, they're created by just individuals and humans that are all facing their own mental burdens, and so we're carrying that as we're still trying to work together and be productive. And I think acknowledging that is something that's very important. I'm looking at the clock right now, and there's so much I still want to ask you, but I won't. And thank you for David for bringing up ERGs, which I wanted to go into as well, the role ERGs have, as well as how you can properly form them. And so perhaps we can definitely have further discussion down the road about that. But we just have a couple moments left, and I just want to give the opportunity to end on a positive note and a hopeful note. And if we wouldn't mind just going around and say, what are something that we're hopeful about in terms of diversity and inclusion, and what that means right now in this moment of history and in this modern work environment. I think that could really allow us to enter the weekend with some new perspectives. And so why don't we start with you, Danielle? Do you mind starting us off?
Sure. I would say it's kind of start with yourself. Start with looking internally and understanding where you came from and what got you here and where you want to go. And I think knowing where you want to go, at least for me, it kind of fills me with so much energy because that kind of gives me something to aspire to.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Monica, do you want to go next?
Okay, I would say now is a great time for us to figure out the difference between I and me. I is how I see myself. Me is how you see me. I want you to listen to my I and meet me there. And I think because we don't have all of the noise of being in the office, and we're basically, a lot of us are just doing this, it's a lot easier for me to focus on, okay, what's important to you? Even if it's looking at, all the different backgrounds that everybody has on their Zoom when they're not putting on the fake backgrounds, it says a lot about who they are. So we get a chance to meet each other in a different place. And I think that that's going to be absolutely critical as we move forward to really practice that inclusion.
And I guess to wrap things up on my end here, I would say just some closing thoughts. One, we can just all collectively recognize the moment that we're in, that we do have an opportunity now to have somewhat of a cleaner slate, to build things up with a new foundation. I think right now minds are ripe for change. There's an opportunity to do things differently, to completely rethink our approaches, and start from scratch. So I'm excited for that, that we have this opportunity to really innovate and to change the way that we can approach this space. But with the flip side of that, I'd also say let's have patience with each other. I think, again, balancing act. I said I'd be mentioning that a lot, but I think it's important to recognize the moment and take advantage of this opportunity, but also recognize the challenges in this moment, recognize the need for rest, recognize the need for self-care. I know it's a question we didn't get to, but thinking about any parents in the room right now, I know the challenges that they're facing, and so many people are facing different challenges. And so I think it's important to be patient with ourselves, to be patient with each other. So that's just the hope that I want to put out into the world. But I do think that this is an opportunity that we have if we want to look at things positively. It's been a tough year, but we can build from this, and we can create something newer and better. So I'm optimistic.
That's awesome. Well, on behalf of Sukhi, thank you to all of our panelists for such a thoughtful discussion. Yeah, thank you for your expertise and your eloquence. This was absolutely phenomenal. And I hope everyone who was on the call and got to experience it thought it was useful and cathartic, and have a great weekend to everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Pleasure.